A blind dog, frail and forgotten, is moments away from being put down when a vet notices something unusual. An old, battered collar. What does it mean? Who did this dog save? And why does his journey lead to a place abandoned by the world, but full of secrets waiting to be uncovered? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Lightning flashed across the windows of Riverview Veterinary Clinic as Dr. Natalie Bennett rubbed her tired eyes. The clock on the wall showed 9:45 p.m., and her shoulders ached from another marathon shift. Around her, the clinic buzzed with the sounds of its temporary residents, abandoned pets and strays that filled nearly every available kennel. Just 3 more charts, she mumbled to herself, reaching for her lukewarm coffee. Thunder rolled outside as her pen scratched across the paper, documenting the day's cases. In the background, a chorus of whimpers and occasional barks created a familiar symphony that usually brought her comfort. Tonight, though, it only reminded her of how overwhelmed the clinic had become. The electronic chime of the front door cut through the stormy silence. Officer Gabe Hernandez stepped in, his police uniform dark with rain. In his arms, wrapped in a dripping blanket, lay a German shepherd that looked more like a shadow of a dog than a living creature. "Dr. Bennett," Gabe said, water dripping from his uniform onto the clinic's tile floor. "Found this old boy wandering near Highway 23. Almost got hit twice before I could get to him." Natalie quickly cleared her desk and gestured to the exam table. "Bring him here." As Gabe set the dog down, Natalie's heart sank. The German shepherd's fur was matted and filthy, his ribs clearly visible beneath his skin. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clouded over and unseeing, staring into nothing. "He's blind," she said softly, running her hands gently over his body. The dog didn't resist her touch, too weak to do more than shiver. "He's severely malnourished, dehydrated." "Found a collar," Gabe said, his voice heavy. "Name's Bailey. No tags besides that, though. I called around. Every shelter within 50 miles is packed full." He paused, shifting uncomfortably. "They said if we bring him in, well..." Natalie understood the unspoken message. With his age, condition, and disability, Bailey would be first on the euthanasia list at any shelter. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down even harder on her shoulders. I can schedule it for tomorrow morning," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. "Give him one comfortable night at least." Gabe nodded solemnly and helped her prepare a kennel with fresh blankets and water. They carefully moved Bailey, who barely seemed to register the change. As Gabe left, Natalie knelt beside the kennel, reaching through to scratch behind Bailey's ears. His tail thumped weakly against the blanket, just once, but enough to make her heart crack a little. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him, fighting back tears. Outside, the storm had intensified. Natalie stood in the parking lot, rain soaking through her scrubs as she looked back at the clinic's glowing windows. Through the glass, she could just make out the shape of Bailey's kennel, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a terrible mistake. The morning sun had barely risen when Natalie pulled into the clinic's parking lot. She hadn't slept well, her dreams haunted by Bailey's cloudy eyes and gentle spirit. The weight of what she had to do today sat heavy in her chest as she unlocked the front door. Inside, she went through her morning routine mechanically, feeding the resident animals, checking vital signs, and preparing medications. But her feet kept drawing her back to Bailey's kennel. A soft whine caught her attention as she passed by. Bailey's head lifted slightly at the sound of her footsteps, and something in his posture made her pause. Setting down her clipboard, she knelt beside his kennel. "Hey there, sweet boy," she whispered, reaching through the bars. Bailey shuffled closer, pressing his head against her hand. Despite everything, his presence had a calming effect that made her chest tight with emotion. As she stroked his neck, her fingers caught on something beneath his matted fur. Gently parting the tangled hair, she examined his worn leather collar more closely. Faded letters, barely visible in the morning light, made her lean in closer. "If lost, return to Haven Hill," she read aloud. Below that was another message that made her breath catch. "He saved me once." Bailey's tail thumped softly against the kennel floor, as if responding to the words. Natalie pulled out her phone and quickly searched for Haven Hill. The results were sparse, just a few old newspaper articles mentioning an assisted living facility, but nothing concrete about its location or current status. Looking back at Bailey, she saw something she'd missed before, a quiet dignity beneath his desperate condition. The mysterious message on his collar hinted at a story that deserved to be heard. "No," she said firmly, standing up. "We're not ending your story today." She strode to her office and canceled the euthanasia appointment. When she returned to Bailey's kennel, his tail wagged with more energy than she'd seen yet, as if he understood. "I'll figure out your story," she promised, scratching behind his ears. "Whatever it is." Natalie called her assistant, quickly rearranging her morning appointments. Then she dialed Gabe's number, explaining what she'd found. "A message on his collar?" Gabe sounded skeptical. "That's not much to go on, Doc." "It's enough," Natalie insisted. "Something happened at Haven Hill, and Bailey was part of it. I need to know what." After a moment's hesitation, Gabe sighed. "All right. Keep me posted if you find anything." Natalie gathered some supplies and carefully helped Bailey into her car. He seemed stronger this morning, managing to stand with just a little support. She secured him safely in the back seat, making sure he was comfortable on a thick blanket. Rain started falling again as she pulled out of the parking lot, heading in the direction where she thought Haven Hill might be. The mystery of Bailey's collar and its cryptic message filled her thoughts as she drove through the gray morning. The narrow road wound through thick trees, their branches creating a tunnel of shadows overhead. Natalie slowed her car as she approached what remained of Haven Hill. The 3-story building loomed before her, its Victorian architecture still visible beneath years of neglect. Paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips, and several windows gaped open, their glass long since shattered. In the passenger seat, Bailey suddenly lifted his head. His tail began to thump against the leather, and a soft whine escaped his throat. Natalie glanced at him, surprised by the change in his demeanor. "You know this place, don't you?" she asked softly, pulling up to the crumbling front steps. The front garden, once carefully tended, had become a tangle of overgrown bushes and weeds pushing through cracked concrete. A rusty wheelchair sat abandoned near the entrance, its wheels partially buried in fallen leaves. Natalie helped Bailey out of the car, and despite his weakness, he seemed more alert than before. She guided him carefully up the worn steps to the heavy wooden door. Its brass knocker echoed hollowly when she used it. Minutes passed. Just as she was about to knock again, the door creaked open. An elderly man with silver hair and kind eyes stood in the doorway. He wore a worn cardigan and leaned slightly on a wooden cane. The moment his gaze fell on Bailey, his eyes widened in disbelief. "You found him," he whispered, his voice breaking. Tears welled in his eyes as he reached out a trembling hand toward the dog. Bailey's tail wagged faster, and he pressed forward, nose working to catch the man's scent. "I'm Thomas Greer," the man said, his attention still fixed on Bailey. "He was my companion for years. During last winter's blizzard, I got disoriented in the snow trying to check our generator. Bailey ... Thomas paused, swallowing hard. "Bailey found me and led me back inside. I would have frozen to death without him." Thomas opened the door wider, gesturing for them to enter. "Please, come in." The interior of Haven Hill was as neglected as its exterior. Wallpaper curled away from the walls and water stains marked the ceiling. In the common room, a few elderly residents sat in mismatched chairs, their expressions distant and resigned. A single staff member hurried past, looking overwhelmed. Thomas led them to a small sitting area where Bailey immediately pressed against his leg, as if making up for lost time. Despite his blindness, the dog's devotion was clear in every movement. "The staff shortages started 6 months ago," Thomas explained, his hand resting on Bailey's head. "There weren't enough people to watch everything. One day, someone left a door open, and Bailey—" He shook his head. "We searched everywhere, but he was just gone." Natalie watched as Thomas stroked Bailey's fur, noting how the elderly man's hands shook slightly. She took in the peeling paint, the dusty surfaces, and the quiet desperation that seemed to fill every corner of Haven Hill. Thomas led Natalie through Haven Hill's dim corridors, their footsteps echoing against the scuffed linoleum floors. The air felt heavy with the musty smell of mildew, and water stains spread across the ceiling like dark continents. "Watch your step here," Thomas warned, pointing to a buckled section of flooring. "We've been asking for repairs for months." In what was meant to be a recreation room, elderly residents sat in threadbare chairs, staring at a TV with poor reception. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting strange shadows. A lone checkerboard sat abandoned on a corner table, its pieces scattered and dusty. "The budget cuts started small," Thomas explained, his voice heavy. "First, it was the activities program, then the maintenance staff. Now we're down to skeleton crews for basic care." They rounded a corner and nearly collided with a harried-looking woman in scrubs. Her graying hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "Ellen," Thomas said warmly, "this is Dr. Natalie Bennett. She found Bailey." Ellen's tired expression turned guarded. "A doctor. Did Victor send you?" "I'm a veterinarian," Natalie clarified quickly. "I found Bailey by chance." Ellen's shoulders relaxed slightly, but suspicion still lined her face. "Well, you should know what you're walking into. I'm running this place with half the staff we need. Victor Barnes, our administrator." She gave a bitter laugh. "Haven't seen him in weeks, but his new sports car is parked at the country club every weekend." As they talked, Bailey walked slowly through the hallway. Despite his blindness, he seemed to know exactly where he was going. Residents reached out to touch him as he passed, their faces transforming with joy. "Hello, sweet boy," an elderly woman called from her wheelchair. "I've missed you so much." "Bailey!" another resident exclaimed, his trembling hands extending to stroke the dog's fur. Natalie watched as Bailey stopped for each person, offering comfort with gentle patience. The change in the residents was remarkable. Faces that had been blank moments before now shone with warmth and recognition. As evening approached, Natalie sat with Thomas in the common room, watching Bailey move from person to person. The dog rested his head on laps, accepted gentle pets, and seemed to know exactly who needed him most. "He's always had this gift," Thomas said softly. "He makes people feel seen, remembered." Natalie watched as Bailey comforted a weeping woman, pressing against her leg until she smiled through her tears. The sight stirred something deep within her. She couldn't walk away from this place, these people, or the corruption that was destroying their home. "Thomas," she said, her voice firm, "tell me everything you know about Victor Barnes." The morning sun cast long shadows across Haven Hill's entrance as Natalie pushed through the heavy doors, her arms laden with supplies for Bailey. A canvas bag hung from her shoulder, filled with premium dog food, a plush blanket, and several soft toys she'd picked up from the clinic. Bailey's head lifted at the sound of her footsteps, his tail thumping against the floor in recognition. Several residents peered out from the common room, their curious expressions following her movements. "Good morning, Bailey," Natalie said warmly, setting down her bags. She knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears as he pressed against her legs. Throughout the day, Natalie sat with the residents, listening to their stories. In a quiet corner of the common room, Thomas's eyes grew distant as he recalled the night Bailey saved his life. "The power went out during that blizzard," Thomas explained, his voice soft with memory. "I'd gone to check the generator, but I slipped on the ice. Couldn't get up." He reached down to pat Bailey's head. "This boy stayed with me for hours in that bitter cold. When the rescue team finally came through, Bailey, blind as he was, kept barking until they found us." Mary Wheeler, a petite woman with silver hair, touched Bailey's fur as she shared her own story. "My Harold passed last spring," she said, dabbing at her eyes. "I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Bailey would come to my room every evening and just sit with me. Sometimes that's all you need, someone to sit with you through the dark times." As evening approached, Natalie joined Thomas and Bailey in the facility's garden. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, casting a gentle light over the untamed grounds. Weeds pushed through cracked concrete paths, and untrimmed bushes reached wildly in all directions. Looking at the weathered building behind them, Natalie saw beyond its peeling paint and sagging gutters. She saw the home it had become, not just a facility, but a place where people had woven their lives together, where memories lived in every corner, where Bailey had touched so many hearts. She watched as Bailey rested his head on Thomas's knee, the old man's hand automatically moving to stroke the dog's fur. The simple gesture spoke volumes about the bonds formed within these walls. "This place," Natalie said quietly, "it's more than just a building, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, his eyes fixed on the sunset. "It's our home. All of us, residents, staff, even Bailey. We're family here." The morning light filtered through Haven Hill's dusty windows as Natalie walked purposefully down the hallway. She found Ellen at the nurse's station, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. The head nurse's fingers flew across a calculator as she muttered numbers under her breath. "These supply costs can't be right," Ellen said to herself, not noticing Natalie's approach. Dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. A resident called out from down the hall. "Nurse Ellen, my medication!" "Just a minute, Mr. Peterson," Ellen shouted back, running her hands through her graying hair. The phone started ringing, and she reached for it with an exasperated sigh. "Let me help," Natalie offered, stepping forward. "We need to talk about Victor Barnes." Ellen's shoulders stiffened. She set down the phone without answering it. "There's nothing to discuss," she said sharply, shuffling papers into a messy pile. "The residents deserve better than this," Natalie pressed. "You deserve better." Ellen's defensive posture slowly crumbled. She glanced around to ensure they were alone, then spoke in a hushed voice. "Victor's been bleeding this place dry for years, cutting staff, skimping on supplies, ignoring repairs." Her hands trembled slightly. "He takes the funding and spends it on himself. Fancy cars, expensive trips." "Have you reported him?" "Multiple times." Ellen's bitter laugh held no humor. "The board just brushes it off. Victor's got friends in high places." She looked down at her hands. "I've stayed because who else would care for them? These people, they're like family to me." Natalie leaned forward. "Help me gather evidence against him. We can build a case." Ellen hesitated, worry lines deepening around her mouth. "It won't be easy. Victor's careful about covering his tracks. but not impossible. After a long moment, Ellen nodded slowly. I'll help. For the residents. As Natalie left the office, she passed the common room. Bailey lay curled up next to Mrs. Wheeler, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his fur. The elderly woman's face held a peaceful expression that had been absent during their previous encounters. The sight strengthened Natalie's determination. Haven Hill and its residents deserved justice, and she would fight to make it happen. Natalie's footsteps echoed through Haven Hill's dim hallway as she made her morning rounds. The sound of metal scraping against metal caught her attention. Around the corner, she found Michael, the janitor, tightening screws on a loose handrail. His weathered hands worked methodically, each movement precise and practiced. "Morning, Michael," Natalie said warmly. "Need any help?" He glanced up, offering a tired smile. "No, ma'am, just routine maintenance." He tested the handrail with a firm shake. "Can't have our residents getting hurt." Natalie watched him work for a moment. "You must see a lot around here. Have you noticed anything concerning about Victor Barnes' management?" Michael's shoulders tensed. His hands stilled on the handrail, and he avoided her gaze. "I just fix what needs fixing, Doctor. Bennett. Try not to get involved in politics." Later that afternoon, as Natalie checked on Mrs. Wheeler, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Michael stood behind her, nervously glancing down the hallway. "Could we talk?" he whispered. "Privately?" Natalie followed him to a storage room filled with cleaning supplies and old equipment. Michael closed the door quietly behind them and reached behind a stack of boxes. He pulled out a thick manila folder, its edges worn from handling. "I've been keeping records," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He opened the folder, revealing neat stacks of papers. Financial statements, maintenance requests that were denied, emails about budget cuts. His fingers trembled slightly as he pointed to highlighted sections. "See these numbers? They don't add up. Money marked for repairs, supplies, staff salaries. It all disappears into these personal accounts." Natalie studied the documents, her heart sinking at the extent of Victor's deception. "How long have you been collecting these?" 3 years. Michael's shoulders slumped. I wanted to say something, but Victor, he's got friends in high places. Nobody would believe the janitor over him. I didn't know who to trust. He handed her the folder. "If you're serious about helping Haven Hill, maybe this can make a difference." Natalie clutched the folder to her chest. "I'll be careful with this, Michael. Thank you for trusting me." Michael hesitated, his weathered face creased with worry. "Watch your back. Victor won't go down easy. He's got connections, people who owe him favors." As Natalie left the storage room, she felt something brush against her leg. Bailey stood there, his tail wagging gently as he nudged her hand with his nose. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his soft fur. "We've got work to do, boy," she whispered, the weight of Michael's folder heavy in her arms. The staff lounge at Haven Hill was quiet, except for the rustling of papers and occasional sighs. Natalie, Ellen, and Michael huddled around a small table, its surface covered with documents from Michael's folder. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they sorted through years of financial records. "Look at this," Ellen said, pointing to a spreadsheet. "These maintenance requests were approved and funded, but the work was never done." Her fingers traced down a column of numbers. "Where did that money go?" Michael nodded grimly. "Into Victor's personal accounts. I've tracked the transfers." He pulled out another document, his hands trembling slightly. "He's been doing this for years." Natalie spread out several emails showing denied staff requests. He claimed budget constraints while padding his own pockets. Bailey lay nearby on a worn carpet, his head resting on his paws. His ears twitched occasionally as they spoke, as if following their conversation. "We need to take this to the board," Ellen said firmly, straightening in her chair. "Go over Victor's head directly." Michael's face paled. "He won't like that. He's got friends everywhere." "We don't have a choice anymore," Ellen replied, her voice softening. "Look at what this has done to our residents. The understaffing, the poor conditions. They deserve better." They began organizing the documents, creating a clear timeline of Victor's misdeeds. Natalie focused on the most damaging evidence: unauthorized fund transfers, falsified maintenance records, and denied essential supplies despite available budget. "We should emphasize how this affects the residents," Natalie suggested, arranging the papers into neat piles. "That's what matters most." Ellen nodded in agreement. "I can provide specific examples of how the cuts have impacted care quality." Michael contributed his detailed maintenance logs, showing the building's declining condition. Bailey lifted his head occasionally, watching them work with cloudy but attentive eyes. As they finished compiling their evidence, Natalie's phone chimed. She opened her email and let out a small gasp. "The board responded," she announced, her voice tight with anticipation. "They'll meet with us next week." Ellen and Michael exchanged nervous glances. The weight of what they were about to do settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Natalie looked down at Bailey, who had dozed off at her feet. "You've brought us this far," she whispered, reaching down to stroke his fur. "We're not stopping now." The morning sun filtered through Haven Hill's dusty windows as Natalie strode purposefully toward the nurse's station. Ellen stood there, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, methodically organizing medication charts. "Morning," Natalie said, setting her bag down. "I was thinking we should reach out to the residents' families. Let them know what's happening here." Ellen's hands paused over the charts. She looked up, her expression guarded. "Most of them stopped visiting years ago." She sighed, then reached for a worn folder in her desk drawer. "But here's the contact list, if you want to try." They set up in the small office adjacent to the nurse's station. Ellen pulled up an extra chair while Natalie spread out the paperwork. The list was long, filled with names and numbers that represented countless broken connections. The first few calls were discouraging. "Not interested," one family member said curtly before hanging up. Others listened politely but remained distant, their voices tinged with years of disappointment. "Mrs. Wilson hasn't had proper care in months," a frustrated daughter complained. "Why should we believe anything will change now?" Natalie listened patiently, explaining about Bailey's return and the steps they were taking to improve conditions. She described the German Shepherd's impact on the residents, how his presence had sparked new life in the facility. In the hallway, Michael worked quietly, his tools spread out beside a wheelchair with a squeaky wheel. The gentle sound of his wrench turning mixed with the murmur of phone conversations. He moved from task to task, tightening loose doorknobs and adjusting hinges that had hung crooked for too long. "My father used to talk about that dog," one son said, his voice warming. Maybe it's time I came to see him again." By early afternoon, several families had agreed to visit. Ellen looked surprised as Natalie added another name to their list of confirmed visitors. "That's Margaret's grandson," Ellen said softly. "He hasn't been here in over 2 years." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Natalie headed to the garden. She found Bailey there, his tail wagging as he moved between a small group of residents seated on benches. Despite his blindness, he navigated perfectly between their wheelchairs and walkers, stopping to rest his head on their laps, or accept gentle pats. Thomas sat among them, smiling as he watched Bailey bring a rubber ball to Mrs. Chen, who laughed and tossed it a short distance. The dog found it easily, guided by the sound of its bounce, and brought it back to her. Natalie watched the scene unfold, warmth spreading through her chest. These moments of joy and connection were exactly what the families needed to see. Bailey had already begun to transform Haven Hill. Now they just needed to show others it was possible. The front doors of Haven Hill swung open with a bang, and Victor Barnes strode in, his polished shoes clicking against the worn linoleum. His expensive suit and carefully styled hair stood in stark contrast to the facility's shabby interior. From her position in the common room, Natalie watched as residents seemed to fold into themselves, turning away or ducking their heads. Bailey, who had been lying at Thomas's feet, raised his head and let out a low growl. Thomas placed a gentle hand on the dog's neck, quieting him. "Ellen!" Victor's voice boomed through the hallway. "My office now. And bring that veterinarian with you." Ellen caught Natalie's eye from across the room, her jaw tight. They followed Victor into his office, where he settled into his leather chair like a king on his throne. "What's this I hear about unauthorized visitors coming to my facility?" Victor's voice dripped with disdain. "And that mongrel, it needs to go. Today." "Bailey is a certified emotional support animal," Natalie countered, keeping her voice steady despite her rising anger. "He provides genuine comfort to the residents, especially Thomas. The improvement in their well-being since his return is remarkable." Victor's lip curled. "I don't care if he's the second coming. That dog is a liability. One slip, one fall, and we're looking at lawsuits." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "Get rid of it by tomorrow, or there will be consequences. For everyone." Ellen stepped forward. "The residents have rights, Victor. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," Victor cut her off, standing abruptly. "This is my facility. Don't forget who signs your paychecks." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. "Tomorrow, no exceptions." The door slammed behind him, leaving Ellen and Natalie in stunned silence. After a moment, Ellen sank into a chair, her hands shaking with anger. 20 years I've worked here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've watched him tear this place apart piece by piece. I'm done with his threats." Natalie pulled up a chair beside her. "The board meeting is still on for next week. We have the evidence, and with the families coming to visit, we'll have even more support." Ellen nodded, straightening her shoulders. "You're right. We need to focus on making those visits count. Show them what Haven Hill could be again." Through the office window, they could see Bailey making his rounds in the common room, stopping to rest his head on residents' laps, bringing smiles to tired faces. They wouldn't let Victor take that away. A gentle breeze rustled through the courtyard as families began arriving at Haven Hill. Natalie and Ellen stood at the entrance, greeting each visitor with warm smiles despite their nervousness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the worn welcome mat, highlighting years of wear and tear. "Welcome to Haven Hill," Natalie said, extending her hand to a middle-aged woman in a blue cardigan. "I'm Dr. Bennett, and this is Ellen, our head nurse." As they led small groups through the facility, reactions varied. Some visitors wrinkled their noses at the musty smell, while others touched the peeling wallpaper with dismay. A few shook their heads, muttering about the state of disrepair. Sarah Chen arrived mid-morning, clutching her purse tightly as Ellen led her to the common room. Her mother, Mrs. Chen, sat in her usual corner chair, staring out the window. But when Bailey padded over and gently placed his head in her lap, Mrs. Chen's face transformed. "Ma," Sarah whispered, watching in amazement as her mother stroked Bailey's fur and smiled, something she hadn't seen in months. "The dog visits every day," Ellen explained softly. "Your mother always lights up when he's around." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "I haven't seen her this happy in so long. This is remarkable." In another corner of the room, David Miller's angry voice rose above the quiet chatter. This is unacceptable. Look at these conditions." He gestured at the water stains on the ceiling. But his tirade stopped short when he heard familiar laughter. His father sat at a card table with 3 other residents, dealing out a hand of poker. His face animated as he told a story. Bailey lay nearby, his tail thumping steadily against the floor. "Dad seems different," David said, his anger deflating. "More like his old self." As the afternoon wound down, families gathered in the main hall. Many approached Natalie and Ellen, offering support and asking how they could help. Some wrote down contact information, promising to attend the upcoming board meeting. In the garden, Natalie settled onto a bench beside Thomas, watching as the last few families made their way to their cars. Bailey rested at their feet, his chin on Thomas's shoe. Through the garden gate, they could see visitors waving goodbye, their faces holding something that hadn't been there when they arrived. Hope. The staff lounge hummed with nervous energy as Natalie, Ellen, and Michael spread documents across the break room table. Coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches littered the edges of their workspace while they sorted through months of evidence against Victor Barnes. "These maintenance requests were denied 3 times, Michael said, pointing to a stack of papers. Each time, the money was there in the budget, but somehow it disappeared. He arranged the documents chronologically, revealing a pattern of funds vanishing shortly after being allocated. Ellen leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "And here's where he claimed we couldn't afford new beds. But look at these deposits to his personal account." She tapped a bank statement with her pen. "The amounts match exactly." Bailey wandered between their chairs, his tail wagging gently as he moved from person to person. He paused at Michael's feet, resting his head on the janitor's knee, until Michael absently reached down to scratch behind his ears. "I spoke with Margaret on the board yesterday," Ellen said, straightening up. "She seemed genuinely shocked when I mentioned the staff cuts. Said Victor told them we were fully staffed." A small smile crossed her face. "She wants to hear more." "That's something," Natalie replied, organizing another set of documents. "How many board members might be on our side?" 3, maybe 4, Ellen said. "Out of 7, it's a start." Michael finished arranging his timeline of emails and financial records, each piece of evidence clearly labeled and cross-referenced. The careful organization reflected his years of quiet observation and meticulous record-keeping. As they worked, Natalie noticed something different in the air. The usual tension that filled Haven Hill had shifted into something more purposeful. Ellen no longer snapped when interrupted, instead sharing knowing looks with Michael when they discovered new evidence. Michael, typically so reserved, spoke up more frequently, contributing valuable insights about Victor's patterns of behavior. Bailey moved to Natalie's side, settling down with a contented sigh. She reached down to stroke his soft fur, taking a moment to observe her unlikely team. Ellen had rolled up her sleeves, her usual stern expression replaced with determination. Michael stood at the whiteboard, drawing connections between dates and documents with surprising confidence. "We're almost there, boy," Natalie whispered to Bailey, who thumped his tail in response. The group agreed to meet at 7 the next morning for a final review before the board meeting. As they gathered their materials, their shared sense of purpose was almost tangible. They weren't just individual staff members anymore. They had become a united front, ready to fight for Haven Hill and its residents. The early morning sun streamed through Haven Hill's windows, casting long shadows across the common room floor. Natalie arranged chairs in a semicircle, while Ellen sorted through her notes one last time. Michael wheeled in a small projector screen, his movements careful and deliberate. Bailey sprawled near the window, his gray muzzle resting on his paws as he soaked in the warm sunlight. Down the hall, the sounds of breakfast preparations and quiet conversation signaled the start of another day at Haven Hill. "Let's run through it in order," Natalie suggested, settling into one of the chairs. "Ellen, you're up first." Ellen stood, smoothing her Navy uniform. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but grew stronger as she spoke. 2 years ago, we had 12 full-time nurses. Now we're down to 4. Our residents need consistent care, but with current staffing levels, we're stretched beyond our limits. She held up a thick folder of incident reports. These represent medication delays, missed physical therapy sessions, and other care issues, all because we simply don't have enough hands. Michael stepped forward next, his usual shyness replaced by quiet determination. He pointed to the financial charts he'd prepared. "This red line shows approved maintenance budgets," he explained, indicating a downward trend. "The blue line shows actual spending. The difference, over $200,000, was diverted to accounts controlled by Victor Barnes." He laid out copies of bank statements and forged invoices, each one carefully highlighted. Natalie tied everything together, her voice clear and passionate. "Haven Hill isn't just a building, it's a home. These residents deserve dignity, safety, and proper care. Instead, they're living with leaky roofs, broken heating systems, and inadequate staffing. The evidence shows years of systematic neglect and fraud. We're asking the board to take immediate action before it's too late." As they finished their run-through, a small group of residents had gathered nearby. Mrs. Chen sat in her wheelchair, nodding approvingly. Mr. Rodriguez, who rarely left his room, stood in the doorway with his walker, listening intently. Thomas stepped forward, Bailey rising to follow him. The elderly man's eyes were bright with emotion as he placed a weathered hand on Natalie's shoulder. "You've got this," he said warmly. "We believe in you." Bailey wagged his tail, moving between the team members as if offering his own encouragement. Other residents voiced their support, a quiet, "Good luck" from Mrs. Chen, a firm nod from Mr. Rodriguez. Natalie gathered the evidence into her briefcase, each document representing another piece of their case against Victor Barnes. She took one final look at their work before preparing to head home for the night. The morning sun glinted off the glass-fronted administrative building as Natalie, Ellen, and Michael approached the entrance. Their footsteps echoed in the marble lobby, each carrying folders filled with months of careful documentation. Ellen clutched her medical records close to her chest, while Michael's weathered hands gripped his maintenance logs tightly. The conference room doors opened to reveal 6 board members seated in expensive leather chairs, their expressions carefully neutral. Victor Barnes sat at one end of the table, wearing an expensive suit and a smirk that made Natalie's stomach tighten. "Please begin," the board chair said, gesturing to the empty chairs. Natalie stood, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Haven Hill isn't just a facility, it's a home. Our residents deserve better than crumbling walls and skeleton crews." She shared stories of the residents' struggles, then described how Bailey had brought light back into their lives. "This dog showed us what Haven Hill could be again, with proper care and management." Ellen rose next, her nurse's uniform stark against the room's polished wood panels. "We're dangerously understaffed," she stated, laying out scheduling sheets and incident reports. "Last month, Mrs. Chen waited 40 minutes for help after a fall, because I was the only nurse on duty for 28 residents." Michael's presentation was quiet, but devastating. His careful records revealed years of financial manipulation, maintenance funds that vanished, inflated invoices, and suspicious transfers to offshore accounts. Victor's confident smile began to fade. He jumped to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous. They clearly don't understand the complexities of running a facility." "We understand perfectly," Ellen cut in, her voice sharp. She pulled out a stack of emails. These messages show Mr. Barnes discussing Haven Hill's sale to developers without board approval. He planned to force our residents out for a profit. The board members exchanged troubled looks as they examined the evidence. After a tense discussion, the chair cleared his throat. Mr. Barnes, you are placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Victor's face turned red. He snatched his briefcase and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Natalie released a long breath, her shoulders finally relaxing. She shared a meaningful look with Ellen and Michael as they gathered their materials. Together, they had taken the first step toward saving Haven Hill. The morning light streamed through Haven Hill's windows as residents gathered in small groups, whispering excitedly about Victor's suspension. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted from the building. Even the creaky floorboards seemed less noticeable under the buzz of optimistic chatter. In the staff lounge, Natalie and Ellen sat at a small table, papers spread between them. Steam rose from their coffee cups as they mapped out their priorities. "We need to address the staffing shortage first," Ellen said, tapping her pen against a schedule filled with gaps. "Our nurses are exhausted, and we can't keep running on skeleton crews." Natalie nodded, jotting notes. "I've got a list of local businesses that might help. The hardware store owner already mentioned donating supplies when I told him about Michael's repair backlog." Throughout the day, Natalie worked the phones from her makeshift office, really just a corner desk in the medical supply room. She called contractors, medical supply companies, and local charities, explaining Haven Hill's situation. To her surprise, many were eager to help, offering discounted services or donations. Ellen moved through the halls with renewed energy, organizing the remaining staff into more efficient shifts. She spent extra time training a new volunteer, showing her the proper way to help residents with their daily routines. In the maintenance workshop, Michael pulled out his tools with purpose. The broken heating vent in room 205 had been waiting months for repair. Now, with proper funding assured, he could finally fix it properly. His weathered hands worked steadily, and the satisfied smile on his face spoke volumes. Bailey padded through the common areas, his presence bringing smiles to tired faces. He spent extra time with Thomas, resting his head on the old man's lap, while Thomas read aloud from his favorite book. The bond between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. As evening approached, Natalie found Ellen and Michael in the garden. They settled onto a wooden bench, surrounded by overgrown roses and wild daisies that swayed in the gentle breeze. Through the open windows, they could hear the sounds of a card game in progress, punctuated by bursts of laughter. "The interim administrators seem decent," Ellen said, relaxing for what felt like the first time in months. "They actually listened when I explained what we need." Michael nodded, wiping dirt from his hands. "Fixed 3 major repairs today. Feels good doing work that'll last." Natalie watched a group of residents enjoying their evening social hour through the window. The sound of their genuine laughter drifted out into the garden, a melody she hadn't heard in Haven Hill for far too long. A gentle autumn breeze rustled through Haven Hill's newly trimmed hedges as Sarah Martinez, notebook in hand, walked up the freshly swept path. Her press badge caught the morning light as Natalie greeted her at the entrance. "Welcome to Haven Hill," Natalie said warmly, holding the door open. "We've been looking forward to sharing our story." Sarah's eyes widened as she stepped inside, taking in the transformed interior. The halls gleamed with fresh paint, and bright sunlight streamed through clean windows. Residents sat in comfortable chairs, engaged in conversation or reading books from the newly stocked library cart. "It's hard to believe this is the same place I heard about just weeks ago," Sarah remarked, scribbling notes. As they toured the facility, staff members nodded politely, gradually warming to Sarah's presence. In the dining room, the cook proudly showed off new kitchen equipment donated by a local restaurant supply company. The tour led them to the common room where Thomas sat in his favorite armchair, Bailey resting at his feet. Sarah settled into a nearby chair, recorder in hand, as Thomas began his story. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Bailey," Thomas said, his voice soft with emotion. "That blizzard hit so suddenly. I'd gotten turned around in the grounds, couldn't see 2 feet in front of me. But Bailey, ... He reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "This brave boy led the rescue team straight to me, even though he couldn't see himself." Other residents gathered around, eager to share their own stories. Mary spoke about how Bailey would sit with her during anxiety attacks, his steady presence calming her nerves. Frank described how the dog seemed to know exactly when someone needed comfort, always appearing at just the right moment. Ellen joined them, her nurse's uniform crisp and clean. "The changes we've seen here are remarkable," she told Sarah. "Local businesses have stepped up with donations, volunteers come in daily, and our staff finally has the resources they need. But none of this would have happened without Bailey bringing Natalie to our door." Sarah captured photos as Bailey made his rounds, his tail wagging as residents reached out to pet him. She watched in amazement as even the most withdrawn residents brightened at his approach. Natalie detailed the improvements underway: new medical equipment, expanded activities programs, and building repairs. "The community support has been overwhelming," she explained. "Local contractors volunteered their weekends to fix our heating system. The garden club replanted our grounds. Even the high school art class painted murals in the activity room." A few days later, Natalie stood in Haven Hill's packed common room, holding the local newspaper. Residents and staff gathered close as she began reading the article titled, "Hope Finds a Home: The Transformations of Haven Hill." Her voice trembled with emotion as she read Sarah's words describing Bailey's impact and the community's response. When she finished, the room erupted in applause and cheers for Bailey, who wagged his tail, seeming to understand he was the center of attention. Residents reached out to pat him, their faces glowing with pride and joy. The morning sun cast long shadows across Haven Hill's entrance as Natalie stepped through the front doors. She stopped short, amazed by the sight before her. The front desk had transformed into a makeshift storage area, piled high with boxes and packages of all sizes. Ellen stood amid the chaos, clipboard in hand, methodically sorting through the donations. "You won't believe what's come in," Ellen said, her eyes brighter than Natalie had ever seen them. "Medical supplies from the hospital, fresh linens from the hotel downtown, even garden tools from the hardware store." She held up a handwritten note. "This sweet lady sent her grandmother's quilts. Said she wanted our residents to feel the same warmth she did growing up." Throughout the morning, a steady stream of volunteers arrived. A local construction crew pulled up in their trucks, tools ready to tackle the leaky roof and temperamental plumbing. In the overgrown garden, members of the garden club worked steadily, clearing away years of neglect. The sound of rakes scraping and pruning shears snipping filled the air. Bailey made his way through the bustling halls, greeting everyone with gentle tail wags. Children from the elementary school giggled as he passed, taking breaks from hanging colorful artwork on the freshly primed walls. The dogs seemed to sense the excitement, moving from person to person, as if supervising the transformation. Thomas sat in his favorite spot on the front porch, watching as painters worked on the building's exterior. His weathered face broke into a wide smile as a group of children approached, carefully carrying a hand-painted banner between them. "Thank you, Haven Hill," it proclaimed in bright, hopeful letters. Families who hadn't visited in months returned, bringing fresh energy and ideas. Some helped organize new activities, while others worked alongside the volunteers. The halls echoed with laughter and conversation, breathing new life into the once quiet building. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the grounds, the last volunteers packed up their tools. Natalie stood outside with Ellen and Michael, taking in the day's progress. The fresh paint gleamed in the fading light, making the building look more like home than it had in years. "We're finally making this a home again," Ellen said softly, her voice full of emotion. Natalie nodded, watching Bailey rest contentedly at Thomas's feet, the perfect picture of peace amidst the positive changes surrounding them. The morning sun warmed the garden as Ellen approached Natalie at the nurse's station, her hands fidgeting with her clipboard. Her usual confident demeanor seemed subdued, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "I need to talk to Thomas," Ellen said quietly, "about my father." Natalie looked up from her paperwork, noting the mix of determination and uncertainty in Ellen's eyes. "Are you sure?" "Yes, it's time." Ellen's voice wavered slightly. Would you come with me?" They found Thomas in the garden, sitting on his favorite bench with Bailey stretched out at his feet. The German shepherd's ears perked up as they approached, and his tail thumped gently against the ground. Ellen lowered herself onto the bench beside Thomas, her shoulders tense. Bailey shifted closer, resting his head on her knee, as if sensing her distress. "I've been angry with you for a long time," Ellen began, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas turned toward her, surprise evident on his weathered face. His hands, which had been absently stroking Bailey's fur, went still. "About my father," Ellen continued, tears welling in her eyes. "When he decided not to try the treatment, because you advised against it." Thomas's expression softened with recognition and old pain. "Ellen, Please, let me finish," she said. "I blamed you. For years, I blamed you for his choice." Thomas listened as Ellen spoke about her father's final days, about the anger she'd carried, about the way it had shaped her decision to stay at Haven Hill despite everything. "I stayed because of people like you and my father," she admitted, wiping her eyes. "I wanted to protect the residents the way you tried to protect him." Thomas reached for Ellen's hand, his own eyes glistening. "I was afraid," he confessed. "Afraid the treatment would cause him more suffering. I should have explained better, should have shared my fears with you." Bailey nudged Ellen's free hand, and she scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "I'm so sorry," Thomas said softly. Ellen nodded, squeezing his hand. "I know. I think I've known for a while." They stood together, their steps slow but purposeful, as they walked back toward the building. Natalie watched from her spot near the garden entrance as Bailey followed behind them, his tail wagging gently in the morning breeze. The morning of Haven Hill's first community open house buzzed with excitement. Residents sat at tables in the common room, carefully arranging homemade cookies on decorative plates, while others hung colorful streamers and banners. The aroma of fresh-baked treats filled the air. "These look wonderful, Mrs. Peterson," Natalie said, admiring a plate of snickerdoodles. She checked her clipboard and turned to Ellen. "The local news crew should be here in an hour." Ellen nodded, directing volunteers who carried flower arrangements donated by the local florist. "The garden looks amazing. I can hardly believe it's the same place." Bailey wandered between the tables, his tail wagging as residents slipped him little treats. His presence seemed to calm everyone's nerves about the upcoming event. When the doors opened at noon, families and community members streamed in. Children ran straight to the garden, laughing as they explored the newly planted flowers and freshly painted benches. Parents and elderly visitors toured the facility, expressing amazement at the transformation. "The difference is incredible," one visitor said, running her hand along the newly painted walls. "It feels so warm and welcoming now. Bailey became the center of attention, patiently allowing children to pet him and pose for photos. His gentle demeanor and obvious bond with the residents touched everyone who met him. Thomas sat in his favorite chair, surrounded by attentive listeners as he shared his story. "Bailey found me in that blizzard," he explained, his voice full of emotion. "Wouldn't leave my side until help arrived. And now look at what he's helped create here." Other residents joined in, sharing their own stories of renewal and hope. Mrs. Chen spoke about how her daughter visited more often now. Mr. Miller described how the improved care had helped him regain his strength. Donation boxes filled quickly, and a sign-up sheet for regular volunteers grew longer by the hour. Local business owners approached Ellen with offers of ongoing support, from weekly fresh produce deliveries to free maintenance services. As the afternoon light softened, Natalie watched the scene before her. Residents chatting happily with visitors, children playing with Bailey, families reconnecting in the garden. The joy in the air was palpable. Ellen appeared beside her, looking satisfied. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Natalie smiled, watching Bailey lead a group of laughing children past them. "And we're just getting started." The transformation of Haven Hill was nothing short of remarkable. Fresh paint brightened the hallways, new windows let in streams of natural light, and the once crumbling walls stood strong and secure. The garden, now a vibrant paradise of flowers and well-tended paths, had become a favorite gathering spot for residents and visitors alike. Laughter echoed through the corridors as residents participated in various activities. Mrs. Peterson taught a weekly baking class in the renovated kitchen, while Mr. Miller led competitive card games in the common room. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, feeling more like a close-knit community than an assisted living facility. Natalie and Ellen worked side by side in their newly organized office, planning the next month's activities. "The painting class has been a huge success," Ellen said, reviewing the attendance sheets. "And the families love joining in during our weekly social hours." Michael, now officially promoted to facilities manager, took immense pride in his expanded role. He conducted daily inspections, trained new maintenance staff, and kept meticulous records of all repairs and improvements. The building systems ran smoothly under his watchful eye. Bailey maintained his special role at Haven Hill, padding from room to room with his gentle presence. Residents took turns walking him through the garden paths, often using these moments to share stories about their lives. Mrs. Chen told Bailey about her childhood dog while guiding him past the rose bushes. Mr. Rodriguez recalled his family's farm animals as they sat together on a garden bench. That evening, as the sky turned golden, Natalie joined Thomas on his favorite garden bench. Bailey lay contentedly at their feet, his tail thumping softly against the ground. The garden around them bloomed with life, butterflies fluttering among the flowers, birds singing in the newly planted trees. Thomas turned to Natalie, his eyes glistening. "You gave us back our home," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Natalie shook her head, smiling. "Bailey did that," she replied. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink over their flourishing garden. The early morning sun filtered through the windows of Haven Hill as Natalie walked through the entrance, her phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes widened as she listened to the caller, and a smile spread across her face. "Yes, absolutely. This would mean so much to everyone here," she said, quickly jotting down details on a notepad. After hanging up, she hurried to find Ellen and Michael, who were checking maintenance schedules in the staff room. Bailey lay nearby, his head resting on his paws. "You won't believe this," Natalie announced, her voice filled with excitement. "The Golden Heart Animal Awards Committee just called. They want to honor Bailey for his impact on Haven Hill." Ellen's clipboard dropped to her lap. "That's wonderful. The residents will be thrilled." The news spread quickly through Haven Hills halls. Residents gathered in the common room, chattering excitedly about the upcoming ceremony. Thomas beamed with pride as he stroked Bailey's fur. On the day of the ceremony, the community center buzzed with activity. Chairs filled quickly with Haven Hill residents, staff members, and local supporters. Bailey sat regally beside Thomas in the front row, sporting a handsome new leather collar, Natalie's gift for the occasion. The committee chairwoman stepped up to the podium, describing how Bailey's story had captured hearts across the community. She spoke of his heroic rescue of Thomas during the blizzard, his unwavering loyalty to Haven Hills residents, and his role in inspiring positive change. When Thomas took the stage, Bailey following carefully by his side, the room fell silent. Thomas's voice carried clearly as he recounted that frightful night in the blizzard, and how Bailey had refused to leave him, eventually leading rescuers to his location. "Bailey may be blind," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "but he sees what matters most: loyalty, love, and the power of never giving up." The audience wiped away tears as he described how Bailey had become the heart of Haven Hill, bringing comfort to residents and inspiring its transformation. The chairwoman presented a specially designed medal, which Thomas carefully placed around Bailey's neck. Camera flashes lit up the room, and applause thundered as Bailey wagged his tail, seeming to understand he was the center of attention. Natalie watched from the side of the stage, her heart swelling with pride. She observed how Bailey settled contentedly at Thomas's feet, accepting gentle pats from admirers while remaining faithfully close to his beloved friend. Back at Haven Hill, sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows of the conference room as Natalie and Ellen prepared for their meeting. Board members filed in alongside local business owners and community leaders, their faces bright with anticipation. "Thank you all for coming," Natalie began, spreading out detailed plans across the polished table. "We've made incredible progress, but now we need to ensure Haven Hill's future." Ellen stepped forward, presenting charts showing the facility's current status and projected needs. "Our immediate improvements have been wonderful," she explained, "but we need sustainable solutions." The group dove into discussions, their voices animated as they explored different options. A local business owner suggested creating a network of regular volunteers, while another proposed partnerships with nearby restaurants for meal services. "What about a trust fund?" suggested one of the board members. "We could establish a foundation to manage donations and ensure financial stability." Natalie nodded enthusiastically. "And I'd like to propose something else: a community advisory board. We need the voices of our residents and their families to keep us accountable." Michael, standing near the whiteboard, detailed his new maintenance schedule. "Regular inspections, prompt repairs, and preventive care," he explained. "We won't let things slip again." Throughout the meeting, they could hear the happy bustle of resident activity through the open windows. A group of seniors had already started planning a vegetable garden, while others organized weekly game nights and reading circles. "The residents are taking initiative," Ellen noted proudly. "They're making this place their own again." As the meeting drew to a close, Ellen stood by the window, watching residents chat and laugh in the garden below. Bailey lay in the grass near Thomas, his tail wagging as children from a visiting family played nearby. "This place finally feels alive again," Ellen said softly to Natalie, who had joined her at the window. They agreed to host a celebration marking Haven Hill's new beginning. The excitement in the room was palpable as they set a date, everyone eager to commemorate this fresh start. The garden at Haven Hill had been transformed into a magical space for the spring celebration. Twinkling lights hung from the flowering trees like stars brought down to earth, casting a warm glow over the carefully arranged tables adorned with fresh spring bouquets. Cherry blossoms and dogwood petals drifted on the gentle breeze, creating nature's own confetti. Residents emerged from the building dressed in their finest clothes, their faces glowing with pride and excitement, many wearing corsages and boutonnieres donated by the local florist. Families streamed through the garden gates carrying dishes and gifts, their arms laden with homemade casseroles and carefully wrapped packages. Community members who had contributed to Haven Hill's revival mingled with staff and residents, creating a tapestry of joyful conversation and laughter. Children darted between the adults' legs, playing impromptu games of tag. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the mouth-watering aroma of home-cooked dishes that spoke of cherished family recipes and loving preparation. Thomas stood at a small podium, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the gathered crowd. "When Bailey found his way back to us," he began, "he brought more than just himself. He brought hope." His eyes grew misty as he described how the blind German Shepherd had sparked a chain of events that saved their home. His weathered hands gripped the podium gently as he spoke of transformation and second chances. Ellen took her turn at the podium, her usual tough exterior softening as she spoke about the dedication of the staff and volunteers, her voice catching slightly as she mentioned her father's memory. Michael followed, his quiet voice carrying surprising strength as he thanked the community for their support, his usual shyness forgotten in the moment's importance. When Natalie spoke, she emphasized how everyone's contributions, big and small, had created something extraordinary, gesturing to the vibrant garden around them as living proof of their combined efforts. Bailey moved through the crowd like a gentle ambassador, his tail wagging as he accepted scratches and treats from admirers. His nose worked overtime, taking in all the exciting new scents of celebration. Children giggled as they ran past, their energy adding to the festive atmosphere. Some stopped to gently pat Bailey's head, having learned from their parents how special this particular dog was. The garden, once overgrown and neglected, now buzzed with life and music, its pathways lined with freshly planted perennials and heritage roses. Residents shared stories with visitors over plates of food, their faces animated as they described the changes they'd witnessed. Some pulled out phones to show before pictures, making the transformation even more dramatic. The sound of classical music drifted through the air as couples swayed on the makeshift dance floor, and somewhere, a child's delighted laugh rang out. Elderly couples who hadn't danced in years found themselves swaying to the familiar tunes, supported by their families or caring staff members. As the evening began to wind down, Natalie found herself seated at a table with Thomas, Ellen, and Michael. They watched the celebration continue around them, taking in the sight of their transformed home. The garden glowed in the soft light of the hanging lanterns, while the sounds of happiness and music filled the air. Their table had become a quiet island of contentment in the sea of celebration, each of them savoring the moment and the knowledge of what they'd accomplished together. The morning sun cast long shadows across Haven Hill's garden as Natalie pulled into the parking lot. The dew still clung to the grass, sparkling like tiny diamonds in the early light. As she walked toward the entrance, she spotted Thomas and Bailey sitting together on a wooden bench near the rose bushes. Bailey's head rested contentedly on Thomas's knee, his tail sweeping slowly back and forth across the dewy grass. Thomas gently stroked the German Shepherd's ears, his weathered face peaceful as he watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Neither seemed to notice Natalie's approach, lost in their shared moment of quiet companionship. Later that morning, Natalie walked the halls of Haven Hill, taking in the vibrant atmosphere that now filled every corner. In the activity room, Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez sat absorbed in an intense game of chess, while across the room, a group of residents worked on watercolor paintings. Their brushes moved carefully across paper, creating scenes of flowers and landscapes. Through the large windows, she could see several residents tending to the vegetable garden, their hands busy in the rich soil as they planted new seedlings. The sound of their laughter drifted inside, mixing with the gentle classical music playing in the background. In the staff lounge, Natalie found Ellen and Michael reviewing documents over coffee. They looked up with warm smiles as she entered. Ellen was explaining her ideas for new community outreach programs, while Michael nodded, adding suggestions about involving local schools. "We've learned so much these past few months," Ellen said, her eyes bright with purpose. "The residents aren't just people we care for. They're family." Michael agreed, adding, "Everything we do has to keep their needs first." That's what makes Haven Hill special. As the afternoon sun filled the garden with golden light, Natalie stood watching Bailey play with a group of residents. The blind German shepherd moved confidently through the space he knew so well, bringing smiles to everyone around him. Mrs. Wilson tossed a soft ball, which Bailey found perfectly, despite his lack of sight, making the gathered residents cheer and laugh. Looking up at Haven Hill's freshly painted walls and flourishing gardens, Natalie could see how far they'd come. The building seemed to glow with new life, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Sometimes it takes a blind dog to help us see what really matters. If you enjoyed the story of Bailey, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.